asked Colin a while back. I said, so Colin, is Tim Keller, is he, we talk, and I like the image of the rings around the tree.
Right.
Is Tim fundamentally like a dyed-in-the-wool, reformed guy with all of the reform, but with an evangelist heart in New York City that leads him to creatively adapt and
Yeah.
build bridges and give that sort of old Princeton kind of that sort of reform to New Yorkers and a New Jersey. So is that the core leaning, or is Tim, do you think, at the core, a bit of a bigger tent evangelical influenced by post-war evangelicalism, and then got enough,
Yeah.
well, not enough. I mean, he's Reformed and Presbyterian. He's
Right.
a colleague in the PCA with me, but got Reformed theology, and that sort of keeps him tethered and enough boundaries on. So which of those
Yeah.
do you think is Tim?
I even get chills thinking about this because biographies are so illuminating and I learned so much myself. A year ago, 2 years ago, Kevin, I don't know if I could have answered that question. I don't know if I would have known how to answer. But it's very clear when you look at the chronology. First, Tim becomes an evangelical through InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, Big Tent evangelical of the British evangelical sort. Packer, Stott, Lloyd Jones,
Lloyd Jones.
That whole stream in there. Second, he becomes Reformed through Richard Lovelace on Jonathan Edwards, but then also Roger Nicole on Neo-Calvinism. So,
and R.C. Sproul and Kathy Keller?
Yeah, and then R.C. Sproul's definitely a factor in there as well. R.C. had a big effect on both of them, but especially on...
He did their wedding.
And they did their wedding, but of course came kind of right before their last semester, essentially. But yeah, Gerstner, there was a huge revival, a Reformed revival in Pittsburgh. Kathy's from Pittsburgh. And Gerstner and Sproul were a major part of that. Ligonier Valley Study Center was a huge part of that. And then jump from that to then Andrew Lincoln comes from the UK, and Tim doesn't become Presbyterian until the very end of his seminary, and then goes into this brand new denomination, the PCA, that R.C. Sproul told him about. But there's no congregations in the Northeast, so they have to go to Hopewell, Virginia in there. I think that illustrates, Kevin, that progression. And then I'll just add this. I don't know if you and I have talked about this much at length, but you'll recall Marsden's assessment of the CRC, the three different camps, the doctrinalist, the pietist, the transformationalist. Tim's adapted that, as you know, to the PCA.
Right.
Tim's very clear, and when I talked with him for this book, that he is a pietist and a transformationalist. Those are 1 and 1A, or, they're both one. And then 2 is doctrinalist. He doesn't say that he's not a doctrinalist because he subscribes to the standards. He believes in them. But they definitely take a back seat to the transformationalist and pietist approaches. And once he explained that to me, I realized, makes perfect sense. It also explains why some people... He's not their biggest hero in the PCA, because that's just not who he is. It's not his formation. He got too much Bavinck early on in Neo-Calvinism via Roger Nicole, and I think he's even grown into that. And so early days Westminster Seminary for Tim, kind of his peer counterpart on the doctrinalist side would have been Sinclair Ferguson. So they're an interesting contrast with each other. They've got a lot of overlaps, but in this way, Tim's going to emphasize the Neo-Calvinism, the pietism, and Sinclair's going to focus on the standards.
Is that Tim wrote a chapter for a book on Neo-Calvinism? Has that come out yet? That was...
I don't think it has.
We'll have to get that and mention it again. Tim had sent it to me, and I thought in 25 or 30 pages, it was... the clearest distillation of what makes Tim tick, and a lot of brilliance. And, I read it, and Tim, if you're listening, I love you, and not a surprise to you. I read it, I thought, that's why I disagree with Tim.
Kevin, it's interesting. Tim's personality is a synthesist. He likes to bring influences together. He doesn't like to dichotomize these things. I mean, he'll do the third way thing. Interesting. One of the only people who came up as a negative, and I don't want to overplay this, I'm just saying Tim doesn't talk negatively about people. The only person who came up as a contrast with what he's trying to do was Charles Hodge. was the only person. And part of it's because of, I know, Kevin,
I
you're
shake my
shake your
head.
head, but I think it's because, and I learned this late in the stage, and we could have a whole different episode on this, but essentially the neo-Calvinist starts with what we assume, what we share with one another apologetically, essentially before God, made in the image of God. They appeal to reason, believing that you have a God-given ability to be able to think together. Whereas other reform streams start with the dichotomizing, the disagreements about how without the illuminating of the Holy Spirit, there is no commonality in there. Tim is everything about Tim's preaching and evangelism and apologetics makes sense when you start from that theological premise, and that he's on the neo-Calvinist side of that. And all of a sudden, it's like, oh, this is how he approaches everything. Makes a lot more sense. But I'm telling you, I was reading and watching him for 15 years and still didn't connect those dots until we talked about it in that article. So again, I think people will also read the book, and some of them will think, oh, that's why I disagree with Tim. It'll be clearer about why they disagree with him.